My name is Tess Hall, and today I will be presenting on major depressive disorder through a clinical lens, a cultural lens, and an artistic lens. I specifically wanted to do my presentation on major depressive disorder because I was misdiagnosed with this in my freshman year here at HBU, and my best friend was actually properly diagnosed with this, and I think that the differences between those two experiences are interesting to highlight. And also, I just wanted to open up the discussion about how using words like I'm depressed or I have depression to describe having a bad day is incorrect and problematic. So first, we will be discussing it through the clinical lens. So what is major depressive disorder? Major depressive disorder is a common and serious medical illness that negatively affects the way you feel, the way you think, and the way you act. Symptoms include severe and persistent low mood, profound sadness, or a sense of despair. In order to be properly diagnosed with major depressive disorder, your symptoms must last at least 2 weeks, but usually last a lot longer. This can be from months to even years. Other symptoms include having a loss of interest in activities that you once enjoyed. So, for example, if you once enjoyed playing tennis with your friends and then you just stop because you didn't find enjoyment in that activity anymore, that would be a symptom. There can also be changes in appetite. Specifically, these relate to weight loss or weight gain that do not correlate to being on a diet. Your appetite has changed because you are depressed, not because you're trying to gain or lose weight. Another symptom is insomnia or sleeping too much. So either you're having trouble going to sleep at night, which then causes you to sleep all day, or you're just sleeping for a majority of the day rather than being awake for a majority of the day. There can also be an increase in what is referred to as purposeless physical activity, and this can be hand-wringing or pacing, just doing things to sort of keep yourself busy, but for no apparent reason. The most important and most troubling symptom that can come with major depressive disorder is suicidal ideation, which is thoughts of death or suicide, and if anyone experiences these, they should contact a professional or a helpline immediately. So now I would like to discuss just a little bit of my personal experience with major depressive disorder. So firstly, my best friend has an actual diagnosis of this disorder, and I can tell you that it is very real and very scary at times. I only want to share what she was comfortable with me sharing. So that is that she has had it since we were in the 7th grade, and just for context, we're both sophomores in college now. So she has had this disorder and been struggling with it for the past 8 years. Thankfully, now that she has this diagnosis, she has been able to work through it a little bit more, and without having to go on medication, she's getting the proper counseling and proper treatment that she needs. Now I want to talk about my incorrect diagnosis. I first came to High Point after being in the same school from the age of 4 to the age of 18 in New York City. So the transition from that to being a freshman in college in North Carolina was obviously difficult, and what I was probably experiencing was adjustment disorder, which is often misdiagnosed as depression or another mood disorder. So basically, I was feeling those things of hopelessness, not fitting in, just sadness, homesickness, all of that. But I was diagnosed with depression, specifically major depressive disorder, rather than adjustment disorder. So as someone who thought that they had major depressive disorder, I really let that define me. But in a more problematic sense, it defined the way that I saw other people who had the diagnosis of depression, and I am not a proper representative for that, only because I've never actually had depression. I went to a separate psychologist in New York once I got out of High Point for the summer, and they said, you don't have depression, you have depressive tendencies, but it was in proportion to what you were experiencing as a freshman in college 8 hours away from where you have lived for the past 18 years. And so when I would talk to my best friend about having this diagnosis, I figured out that we had completely separate things going on. Once I was home and back with my family, and my mom came and even saw me while I was at High Point, I was fine. I was no longer feeling this sense of hopelessness or sadness. My friend constantly had that sense of hopelessness or sadness no matter where she was, because she has major depressive disorder, not because she was simply uncomfortable with a certain situation. So I talked to her about this, and from her perspective, it was weird for her to see me be like, oh yes, I'm depressed as well, when I in fact was not. And to my own defense, I didn't say I was just because I self-diagnosed myself. I said I was because a professional had told me that I was. But even still, it was problematic for her because she was thinking, well, Tess is okay and functioning properly, but I'm not. Meanwhile, we supposedly have the same psychological disorder going on. So now for the cultural lens, I wanted to talk about self-diagnosis, and specifically why self-diagnosis is so problematic. I also just want to state that it is a completely separate thing if you Google symptoms of something like depression and think, oh, this may be what I'm experiencing, and then you go to a psychiatrist or a doctor and get a proper diagnosis, that's fine. But when you're just Googling symptoms and saying, oh yes, I in fact do have major depressive disorder, that is completely incorrect and very problematic for those who are actually afflicted with this disorder. The main place where you can see this is problematic is when I even see it in my own life. People say, oh, I'm depressed. I'm feeling depressed today. Depression and the word depressed are not words that should be used to describe a feeling. They're clinical verbiage for a clinical diagnosis. So using clinical verbiage for a non-clinical issue is very problematic. Having a bad day or being in a bad mood or just not having the time of your life one day is not the same thing as having major depressive disorder. It is also very important to remember that psychological diagnoses are just as serious as a traditional medical diagnosis. We talked about this a lot this year, where it's very hard to see a psychological diagnosis as super serious because there are no physical symptoms that you can see. However, just because you can't see that someone is struggling or see that someone is hurting, that doesn't mean that they're not, or that their diagnosis or issue is invalidated. The most important thing to remember when either trying to do self-diagnosis or just thinking about psychological diagnoses in general is that you can only be diagnosed with something if what you are feeling or what you are experiencing is not proportional to what is happening in your life at that time. So to bring it back to my personal experience, feeling hopeless and feeling homesick and feeling sad were all completely normal for me to be experiencing as a freshman in my first semester of college, 8 hours from where I've lived for the past 8 years. For my best friend who has a proper diagnosis, her feelings were not proportional to her experience. And just to explain that a little bit further, and I'm not trying to diminish what she's been through, but the worst thing that has happened to her and her family is that her grandparents have unfortunately passed away. But it is normal to feel sad about that while it's happening, while you're in the grieving process. It's not normal to still not be able to get out of bed because you lost a family member 8 years ago. Again, I've known her since I was 4 years old, so I felt that loss a lot too. They were like my own second set of grandparents. However, my grief for that and for her family did not develop into a psychological disorder. For her, it was the pivotal point in her life that kind of flipped the switch where she did develop major depressive disorder. And then just to close out this slide regarding self-diagnosis, I don't want to give off the impression that trying to give yourself something to identify with or say that you have to explain why you are feeling a certain way is entirely bad. If someone is feeling upset or feels like they do in fact have depression and they research it on the internet and say, this is how I feel, and then do bring it to a professional or a counselor and say, hey, I think this is what's going on with me, and they get confirmation that they're correct, that's fine. It's when the words depression and depressed are used to describe a mood that someone is in that day, not a disorder that they have been experiencing for a prolonged amount of time and struggle with day in and day out. I want to just discuss one more thing through the cultural lens. This is that social media, specifically Tumblr, has sort of romanticized the idea of having depression or any other type of mental illness. What's going to pop up on the screen are some of these posts showing that. And the point that I want to hit home with this is that having depression is not trendy, and it is not some sort of club that you can join to make yourself feel better. It is a serious psychological disorder. It is something that has to be talked about delicately and properly. I commend social media for trying to stop the stigma surrounding mental illness. However, in some cases, it has gone completely too far. We should be able to have an open discussion about mental illness and the stigma surrounding it. However, it is not okay to romanticize having one, because people who actually truly struggle with these things don't think it's romantic, don't think it's fun, don't consider it a club that they're a part of. It is something that they deal with day in and day out and struggle with a lot. And that is not something that should then be used for entertainment purposes. I wanted to discuss the clinical and cultural lenses prior to showing my painting so that I could set the stage for how I was inspired to paint this. If I was presenting in person, I would ask what you see when you look at this. However, since we are not, I'm just going to describe it to you. Essentially, the lower 3/4 of the painting is very dark and has sharp lines compared to the upper portion of the painting. It is meant to symbolize that someone is under the water and all that they can clearly feel is the depression, is the hopelessness, is the sadness. Upper portion is the reflection of the water, so just above the surface is a normal life that could be led, but it's distorted because the person experiencing this diagnosis doesn't know how to get to it. This was inspired by my friend with this diagnosis saying that she felt like she was drowning for so many years until she got proper treatment. She said that she felt that she could not live a normal life. Thankfully, that has changed since then, now that she is getting treated properly. Now to bring it back to the artistic lens of this discussion. I wanted this painting to accurately and properly visualize how someone with depression feels when they are in their darkest moment. I believe that I have properly done that through using crisp lines on the bottom and it obviously being the lower portion of a woman's face. Meanwhile, on the top, it is a very distorted reflection of what could be. And so now these are my sources, which include WebMD, Tumblr, Harvard Health, and psychiatry.org. Thank you for your time.